The Galactic Council reviewed human military history, and the room went deathly silent. The drive was already in my hand when the Arbiter called my name. I had not slept the night before. Not really. I had sat in my assigned quarters on Deck 7 of the Council station, staring at the small silver device in my palm, turning it over and over the way my grandmother used to turn her wedding ring when she was nervous. The drive held 11 terabytes of compressed data. 5,000 years of human history, formatted and indexed and reviewed 3 times by the Earth Cultural Liaison Office, signed off by the Secretary General herself, stamped with the official seal of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. 5,000 years. And almost none of it was peaceful. My name is Mara Voss. I am 38 years old. I have a doctorate in military history from the University of Edinburgh, a second doctorate in interstellar diplomacy from the Geneva Institute, and a 4-year-old son named Oliver who had pressed his small face against the departure terminal glass and fogged it with his breath while I walked away. I had not cried then. I was crying now, a little, on the inside, where no alien could see it. I was Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council. Not because I was the most decorated diplomat we had. Not because I had the best record in negotiations. I was chosen because I was a historian. Because the Council had requested that the species representative who submitted the cultural archive also be the person who understood it most deeply. They wanted someone who could answer questions. They wanted someone who knew the whole story. I wonder sometimes if the Secretary General knew exactly what she was sending me into. I suspect she did. I suspect she sent a historian precisely because she knew a soldier would look too eager, and a politician would look too slick, and what we needed in that room was someone who could stand in the fire and not flinch and still tell the truth. The truth was the problem. The truth was always the problem. The council chamber was not what I had expected. I had imagined something cold and bureaucratic, rows of seats rising like a lecture hall, delegates arranged by species designation, all function and no feeling. Instead, the room curved like the inside of a shell. The ceiling was transparent, and below us, directly below, through the floor, was the gas giant the council station orbited, swirling in bands of copper and gold and deep violet. It was, genuinely, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, and I almost did not notice it because my heart was beating so loudly. There were 41 species represented in that room. 41 delegations, some of them with bodies so different from mine that my eyes kept sliding away, unsure how to process the shapes. The Areth occupied a cluster of seats at the far left. They moved as a unit, their pale segmented forms linked at the shoulder by thin filaments, a hive mind that experienced the world as a collective rather than as individuals. The Drell sat closest to me, and I was grateful for that, because they looked almost familiar, upright, two-armed, large dark eyes that watched everything with what seemed like warmth, even if their empathic range meant they could feel my stress radiating off me like heat from an oven. The Cephali elder sat alone at the apex of the curved seating, its 4 upper limbs folded across its chest, its age so visible in the deep channels of its skin that I felt a kind of reverence just looking at it. The species record said Cephali elders could live 4,000 years. This one was estimated at 3,800. It had been alive when Rome was building the Colosseum. The Arbiter, a Veth, coral-skinned, 6-limbed, utterly calm, stood at the presentation platform and called the session to order in that smooth triple-tone voice that sounded like 3 people speaking in perfect harmony. The Veth had been the Council's administrative species for 600 years. They did not take sides. They did not express opinions. They simply ran the machinery of civilization and made it look effortless. Earth's Cultural Archive Review, the Arbiter said. First presentation. Ambassador Mara Voss, representing the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. I walked to the platform. My heels were quiet on the floor. I set the drive in the input cradle and looked out at the room. 41 species. Hundreds of delegates. All of them looking at me with varying expressions of curiosity, patience, and in one case, the Drell nearest the aisle, something that looked worryingly like pity. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Before I begin, I want to say something directly. Humanity's cultural archive is not simple. It is not comfortable. It is the full record of who we were and how we got to where we are today, and some of it is very hard to look at. I paused. I ask that you watch it all the way through. Context matters. It matters more, with us, than with almost anything else I can imagine. The Arbiter tilted its head slightly. It was the Veth equivalent of an encouraging nod. "The Council thanks you for your candor, Ambassador. You may begin." I pressed the start command. And 5,000 years of humanity began to pour into the room. The early sections were almost manageable. Prehistoric tool use. The formation of the first settlements. Trade networks along the Tigris and Euphrates. I narrated carefully, explaining the context of each era, the resources being competed for, the pressures that shaped early human societies. My voice was measured and professional. I had rehearsed this 400 times on the transport ship. I knew exactly what to say. What I had not fully rehearsed was watching the room. I noticed things. Small things, at first. A ripple through the Areth collective when the archive showed the first documented siege fortifications, walls built not to keep animals out but to keep other humans out. The Drell delegate nearest me leaned almost imperceptibly forward. The Cephali elder's secondary eyes, the smaller pair, located just above its primary ones, opened slowly, which I would later learn was a sign of intense, focused attention. They were curious. That was all, for now. Just curious. And I thought, give it time. Give it about 5 more centuries. They will not be merely curious then. I moved through the Bronze Age. Through the great empires of the ancient world. I spoke carefully and clearly, and I tried very hard not to look at the copper and gold planet spinning slowly below my feet, because every time I did, I felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with altitude. It had everything to do with the weight of what was coming. Because I knew what was in that archive. I had spent 15 years studying it. I knew every chapter of it. I knew the numbers, the dates, the names, the turning points, the catastrophes. I knew what the Council was about to see. And I knew that nothing in their combined 600 years of interstellar civilization had prepared them for it. I kept my face still. I kept my voice even. I kept presenting. But my hand, at my side, was gripping the edge of the platform with a quiet, white-knuckled conviction. We were just getting started. Part 2. The first real sound in the chamber came from the Areth side of the room, and it was not a word. It was a tone, low, resonant, the kind of sound a very large bell makes when it has been struck and then muffled immediately. It came from somewhere in the middle of the hive cluster, from one of the smaller subunits whose pale form had gone very still. I glanced toward them without pausing my narration. The other Areth had closed around the still one slightly, the way a hand closes around something fragile. The archive had just displayed the Mesopotamian siege of a rival city-state. Not graphically. Just the schematic overview, troop movements, resource demands, the strategic logic of encirclement. A military historian would call it textbook. Clean. Almost elegant in its simplicity. The Areth, apparently, did not find it elegant at all. I kept talking. Competition over agricultural land and river access drove early organized conflict in this region. The development of siege technology during this period accelerated rapidly because the reward for capturing a fortified settlement was so significant. Resources, territory, population. The winners of these conflicts often became the civilizations that survived long enough to be remembered. The Arbiter's triple-toned voice came from a speaker just to my left. Ambassador. A clarification, if you will. The forces shown in this schematic, they are from the same species. Yes, I said. A pause. From the same planetary region. Yes. Within a few hundred kilometers of each other. Another pause. Longer this time. And the motivation was, grain storage. River access. Primarily, yes. The Arbiter did not say anything further. But I noticed it made a small notation on its standing display. I could not see what it wrote. I did not need to. I moved the archive forward through the centuries. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. The Iron Age gave way to classical antiquity, and the scope of human conflict began to scale in ways that even I, knowing everything that was coming, found quietly staggering when viewed from the outside. This was the strange gift of the presentation. I was seeing my own species as an alien might see it. Fresh. Without the comfort of familiarity. Without the mental padding that comes from growing up surrounded by history until it loses its edges. The edges were very sharp from out here. Rome marched across the archive in all its complicated, extraordinary contradiction. Engineering genius and brutal expansion existing in the same breath. Roads that would last 2,000 years, built partly by people who had no choice but to build them. A legal system that became the foundation of half the world's courts, designed by a civilization that also staged public spectacles of mortal combat for entertainment. I explained the Colosseum carefully. I explained what it was used for. I watched the Drell delegate 3 seats to my left physically lean back in their chair. They watched it, the delegate said. Quietly. Not to me. To itself, or to the delegate beside it. Willingly. It was cultural, I said, because I had heard it. The context of death and suffering was entirely different in that era. I am not defending it. I am describing it. The Drell looked at me with those large, dark eyes. I understand, Ambassador. I am simply processing. I nodded. I kept going. The Great Migrations. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. The rise of the Arab Caliphates. The Viking expansions across Europe and into the North Atlantic. The Mongol conquests, and here the chamber shifted in a way I could feel, a collective intake of attention, because the Mongol Empire's scale was genuinely difficult to communicate without the archive's visual overlay, and the visual overlay was not gentle. A significant portion of the Eurasian continent under a single military command within the span of 2 generations. The speed of it. The comprehensiveness of it. The transformation of entire regions in less than a century. The arbiter paused the display. This was unusual, it had not paused anything before. Ambassador, it said carefully. This expansion, it is carried out by one group of humans against other groups of humans. Yes. And the purpose is territorial control. Territorial control, resource acquisition, and in some interpretations, the establishment of trade security along continental routes. And the human populations in the path of this expansion. What happens to them? I held the arbiter's gaze. Some are absorbed into the empire. Some flee. Some are lost. The arbiter did not ask me to quantify lost. I was grateful for that. The numbers from that particular century were not figures I wanted to read aloud in this room, not yet. We had much further to travel before I reached the numbers that would truly stop the room cold. I needed to pace this correctly. I needed them to understand the arc, not just the peaks. I moved through the Crusades with deliberate care. This section required the most contextual scaffolding of anything so far, because the Crusades involved not just military conflict but ideological framework, the idea that belief systems could be worth dying for, worth sending armies across continents for, in large enough quantities to reshape the political geography of an entire region for 300 years. The Ereth collective had gone very quiet. They were all oriented toward the display now. Not a single subunit was moving independently. They fought over ideas, one of them asked. Not any specific individual, the voice came from the collective itself, flat and shared. Over territory they believed had sacred meaning. Yes. And those on the other side, they also believed it had sacred meaning. Yes. But different sacred meaning. The collective considered this. And neither could simply share it. I looked at the archive display, at the centuries of conflict over a thin strip of land on the eastern shore of a sea that no longer existed as a political boundary. Evidently not, I said. Not at that time. A delegate from the rear of the chamber, a species I had not yet spoken with, multi-limbed, with a cluster of sense organs arranged in a fan pattern above what I took to be its face, spoke up. Its translator rendered its voice as smooth and even. Ambassador Voss. We have been observing your species archive for some time now. My delegation has a question. Of course, I said. When does the conflict end? I looked at the delegate. I looked at the drive sitting in its cradle. I thought about the 2 world wars sitting approximately 4/5 of the way through the archive, waiting like mountains above a fog line. It doesn't end, I said honestly. It changes. It evolves. The scale changes, the technology changes, the reasons change. But the conflict does not simply stop at any point in our history and fail to restart. The chamber absorbed that. Not once, the delegate asked. Not for any significant period. No. A Drell delegate, not the one nearest me, a different one, seated further back, raised one of its upper limbs. Ambassador. I have been monitoring the emotional resonance in this chamber, as is natural for my species. I want to flag that several delegates are experiencing what I would describe as significant distress. It paused. And we have not yet reached the section you indicated, in your preliminary notes, as the 20th century. Every head in the room, alien or otherwise, turned toward me. I stood very straight. I kept my hands flat at my sides. I looked at the Drell who had spoken, and then I looked at the room, and I said the only true thing there was to say. No, I agreed. We have not. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds of 41 species processing the fact that what they had watched so far, the sieges, the empires, the centuries of organized conflict, was not the hard part. And then I pressed the command, and the archive moved forward another 5 centuries, and we kept going. Part 3. I have stood at the edge of the chalk cliffs in East England in winter, when the wind comes off the channel cold enough to make your eyes water before you have even had time to feel sad. I have stood at the wall in Berlin, what remains of it, and pressed my palm flat against the rough concrete and tried to feel what it meant. I have sat in the archive reading rooms at the Imperial War Museum with primary source documents spread across a table in front of me, letters written by young men who did not come home, and I have read every word of them without looking away. I thought I was prepared for this part of the presentation. I was a professional. I had spent 15 years with this material. I knew every date, every name, every turn in the road. I was not prepared for this room. I was not prepared for what it looked like to show it to someone who had never imagined it was possible. The First World War came into the chamber the way all terrible things arrive, quietly, at first, almost reasonable looking. The archive opened with the political structures of early 20th century Earth, the complex web of alliances and colonial systems that had grown across the planet over the previous 2 centuries. I explained the framework carefully. I explained how a single event in a small city in the Balkans had pulled on threads that connected governments across an entire planet, and within 6 weeks the largest military mobilization in human history to that point was underway. The Areth collective asked a question. The same flat, shared voice as before. The trigger event, 1 person. 1 person, I confirmed. 1 moment. The collective processed this. And the resulting conflict involved how many participants? By the end, the conflict had drawn in nations from every populated continent on Earth. Somewhere between 65 and 70 million military personnel were mobilized across the full duration. A long beat. And this began, the collective said slowly, because of 1 person. Because of 1 moment that connected to existing pressures that had been building for decades. The moment was the trigger. The pressures were the cause. I moved forward into the war itself. The archive was not graphic. I had made very specific decisions about the level of visual detail included, and I had erred heavily on the side of restraint, but the data was the data, and data, presented honestly, has its own kind of weight. The trench systems of the Western Front. 400 miles of excavated earth stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 2 opposing forces dug into the ground facing each other across a stretch of open land called no man's land, a phrase I chose not to translate literally for the room, because the concept embedded in it was already baffling enough without the poetry of the name. The arbiter stopped me. Gently, the way you stop someone walking toward a step they have not noticed. Ambassador. The forces on both sides, they are stationary. For extended periods, yes. They simply remain. Facing each other. Yes. For how long? I looked at the timeline marker on the display. The Western Front was essentially static for approximately 3.5 years. The arbiter made another notation. This time I could see its secondary hands were moving quickly, writing faster than before. And in that time, the intent was to advance. To move the line forward. Yes. Did that happen? I pulled up the overlay showing territorial change across the full conflict. The line moved. It moved back and forth across the same scarred Earth for 3.5 years. The maximum sustained advance by either side in any major offensive was measured in miles. A handful of miles, traded back and forth, at extraordinary cost. I gave the numbers. I gave them carefully and without emphasis, because emphasizing them would have been theatrical, and these numbers did not need theater. The chamber went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system for the first time. A delegate I had not heard from yet, the Sethali elder at the apex, spoke in a voice that was barely above a murmur. Its translator rendered the words gently, as though the translator also understood that something needed to be treated with care. Ambassador Voss. These numbers, are they, is there an error? No, I said. No error. These are confirmed figures. Yes. From multiple independent historical sources, cross-referenced and verified. The Sethali elder closed its primary eyes. Just briefly. Then opened them again and looked at me with an expression I did not have a name for, in any language I had ever studied. I moved into the Second World War. I will tell you what I told the room, but I will tell you something else first, something I did not say aloud, because it was not the kind of thing you say in a diplomatic presentation. I will tell you what it felt like to be the person standing there. It felt like carrying something very heavy across a room full of people who had no idea what it weighed. Not because they were weak, but because they had never had to lift anything like it. Because their histories, all 41 of them, had not put this particular kind of weight into the world. I was the only person in that chamber who had grown up with this material as the background noise of existence. History class. Museum trips. The background of every story ever told about the mid-20th century. I had been surrounded by it since childhood until it had become, not normal exactly, but familiar. A known country. Standing in that room, watching 41 species encounter it for the first time, I understood with a sudden and total clarity that familiarity had been a kind of mercy. That I had never, until this moment, truly seen what my species had done, because I had always been too close to it to see the whole shape. From out here, the whole shape was visible. The Second World War opened with the political fragmentation that followed the First, the economic collapse, the rise of extremist political movements across multiple nations, the systematic dismantling of minority rights in several countries, the series of expansions that began years before the first declared act of war. I explained the timeline carefully. I explained the alliance structures. I explained how, once again, an entire planet was mobilized within a span of years. The numbers were larger. The technology was more advanced. The scale of destruction was proportionally greater. And then I reached the section I had dreaded most. I did not skip it. I will say that plainly, I did not skip it, I did not summarize it, I did not soften it. I had made that decision alone, in my quarters, 2 nights before the presentation, and I had not changed my mind. If humanity was going to take a seat at the table of civilizations, it was going to do so with its full history visible. All of it. The parts that made us proud and the parts that made us want to look away. I showed the Council the Holocaust. I showed it with data. Population records before and after. The geography of it. The systematic nature of it. The industrial scale of deliberate elimination of human beings by other human beings, organized, documented, and carried out over the course of years. A Drell delegate in the third row made a sound I had never heard before and have not heard since. It was something between a cry and a held breath, and the delegate's empathic membranes, the faint luminescent tissue along its jaw and neck, went completely dark. The empathic equivalent of a system shutting down to protect itself. No one asked me to stop. No one asked me to explain. No one said a single word. I moved to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The archive showed the 2 detonations. Not with graphic imagery, with data, with the scale of destruction mapped over the city grids, with the timeline of events before and after, with the strategic logic that had driven the decision, and with the human cost in numbers that were precise and verified and left absolutely no room for comfortable abstraction. The mushroom cloud appeared on the ceiling of the chamber, mapped across the transparent dome, and the planet below us, gold and copper and deep violet, was visible through it, and the contrast between those 2 things was so stark and so strange that several delegates looked away from the ceiling and down at the planet instead, as though they needed something beautiful to rest their eyes on. The cloud hung there for approximately 20 seconds before the archive moved to the aftermath. And then the room went silent. Not quiet. Not hushed. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses against the inside of your ears. I stood at the platform and I let the silence exist. I did not rush it. I did not fill it. I had learned, in 15 years of studying human history, that some moments require witness rather than commentary, and this was one of them. The silence lasted 11 minutes. I counted every one of them on my wristband, watching the seconds move, watching 41 species sit with what they had just been shown. 11 minutes. The Sethali elder broke it. The oldest living being in the room, 4,000 years of memory behind its eyes, a witness to more of galactic history than any other creature present. It spoke in that low, careful murmur, and the translator shaped its words into something very close to English. And they did this, it said. Not a question. A statement made very slowly, with enormous care. They did this, to themselves. I looked at the elder. I looked at the room. Yes, I said. And then they stopped. And then they rebuilt. And then they came here. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the one before it. Shorter. Only a few seconds. But it had a different quality, as though the room had shifted slightly on its axis, and everyone in it was recalibrating their footing. A delegate I did not know the species name of, seated at the far right of the chamber, raised one of its forward limbs. Its translator had a slight delay, the older model, I thought. Ambassador Voss. We must ask. How many of your people survived the last century? The global population at the end of the 20th century was approximately 6 billion people, I said. And how many were lost, in this period of the archive? I had known this question was coming. I had prepared the number. I had rehearsed saying it. And it still landed differently than it had in rehearsal, because in rehearsal there had been no room, no elder with 4,000 years in its eyes, no silent delegates who had never imagined any of this was possible. Military casualties across the major conflicts of the 20th century totaled approximately 85 million people, I said. Civilian deaths attributed to the conflicts, including all related causes, brought the total significantly higher. The Drell delegate nearest me, the one whose empathic membranes had gone dark earlier, spoke for the first time since the silence had ended. Ambassador, a pause. How do a people survive that? I looked at them. I thought about Oliver's face against the departure terminal glass. I thought about my grandmother's wedding ring. I thought about 15 years of reading letters written by people who did not come home, and the enormous, impossible fact that some people did. We have been asking ourselves that question for 100 years, I said. We are still not entirely sure. But we did. The chamber breathed. And I was not done yet. Part 4. The arbiter called a recess after the third section of the archive closed. 40 minutes. A formal recess, called by the presiding body of the Galactic Council for the first time in, I was told afterward, 230 years. The last time a recess had been called mid-presentation was during the Kiriti Civilization Review, when the Kiriti ambassador had collapsed from what turned out to be a stress response unique to their species. Even then, the recess had been 30 minutes. Ours was 40. The arbiter had extended it without explanation, and no one in the room had argued. I stood alone at the edge of the transparent floor, looking at the planet below. The gas giant's bands moved slowly, copper sliding past gold, violet folding into a deep blue at the pole that I had not noticed from my seat. It was beautiful in the way that things with no knowledge of their own beauty are always beautiful. Indifferent. Complete in itself. I heard footsteps behind me. Not footsteps exactly, the Sethali elder moved with a kind of deliberate placement of its lower limbs that was more precise than any human gait, each contact with the floor measured and careful. It stood beside me and looked at the planet for a moment without speaking. Then it said, "You are holding yourself very carefully, Ambassador." I turned to look at it. Is it that visible? To someone of my age, yes, the elder's primary eye studied me with a quality of attention that I can only describe as architectural, as though it was reading the structure of me rather than merely the surface. You knew what was in the archive before you came into this room. Of course. And you chose to show it without reduction. Yes. Why? I had been asked this question before. By the selection committee in Geneva. By the Secretary General. By my colleague Nora Price, who had drunk 3 glasses of wine and looked at me across a dinner table the week before departure and said, plainly and with genuine concern, "Mara, you know what it's going to look like to show them all of it," and I had said, "I know exactly what it's going to look like," and that's precisely why it has to be all of it. I gave the Sethali elder the same answer I had given Nora. Because a half-truth is a particular kind of dishonesty, I said. And this council is going to make a decision about whether humanity belongs at this table. I will not ask them to make that decision based on a carefully chosen selection of our history. They see it all, or they decide without seeing it. The elder considered this for a long time. Its secondary eyes, the smaller pair, moved independently of its primary ones, scanning something I could not follow. You are aware, it said eventually, that several delegations are moving toward a formal objection to human membership. I expected it. And you are not concerned? I am very concerned, I said. But not about the objection. About what comes after the rest of the presentation. They have seen the worst of us. They have not yet seen what we did about it. The elder looked at me. Something moved behind its eyes, ancient and evaluating and, I thought, carefully restrained. You have more to show. Yes. It turned back to the planet. Then I will look forward to the remainder. The recess ended. The chamber refilled. The delegates returned to their seats with a different quality of movement than before, quieter, more careful, like people returning to a room where something important had happened and not yet been fully understood. I returned to the platform. The drive was still in its cradle, exactly where I had left it. A delegate from the multi-limbed species at the far right of the chamber did not wait for me to speak. Ambassador Voss, the voice was even, but there was an undercurrent to it. My delegation has consulted during the recess. We wish to table a formal motion to suspend Earth's membership review pending further deliberation. 2 other delegations immediately indicated support for the motion. Then a third. I looked at them. I did not respond immediately. I took a breath, one full, deliberate breath, and I said, I would ask the council to permit me to continue the archive presentation before any motion is entered. What the council has seen is the first half of humanity's record. The second half is what I came here to show you. The arbiter looked to the chamber. No one formally objected to the request. The delegate who had raised the motion lowered its limb slowly. Continue, the arbiter said. I pressed the command. The year is 1945, I said. The Second World War has ended. 85 million people are dead. Entire cities have been removed from the map. Whole populations have been displaced, scattered, and in some cases, erased entirely. The economies of nearly every nation on Earth are under severe strain. The physical landscape of multiple continents has been permanently altered. I paused. And in that same year, in the same world where all of that happened, the nations of Earth sat down in a room together and began writing rules. The archive shifted. The imagery of destruction gave way to something else, conference tables, signed documents, the formation of international bodies. The United Nations Charter, signed by 50 nations in San Francisco. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted and adopted 3 years later. Small, dense documents that looked almost unremarkable against the scale of what had preceded them, but were in fact the most radical thing a species that had just done what we had done could possibly attempt. These documents did not prevent all future conflict, I said. I will not claim that they did. Humanity continued to have conflicts after this point, and some of them were severe. But something had changed. For the first time in human history, there existed international legal frameworks that nations had voluntarily agreed to uphold. Mechanisms for dispute resolution that did not default to force. Standards for the treatment of people that nations had, in writing, committed to observe. A Reth subunit spoke. A single voice, not the collective, which was itself unusual. But if they continued to have conflicts, what was the difference? Accountability, I said. For the first time, there were consequences for violations of these standards. The Nuremberg trials, which concluded at the end of the war, established for the first time in human history that individuals could be held legally responsible for decisions made during conflict, that authority did not grant immunity. That following orders did not absolve a person of responsibility for what they ordered. I let that sit for a moment. No species, I continued, has ever been asked to apply that standard to itself voluntarily. We applied it to ourselves. Imperfectly. With enormous resistance in many quarters. With failures and contradictions and cases where the standard was not upheld when it should have been. But it existed. We wrote it down. We signed our names to it. We built courts to enforce it. And when we failed to meet the standard, there was now a record of the failure, which meant there was no longer any possibility of pretending it had not happened. The Drell delegate whose membranes had gone dark earlier had recovered. They were watching me now with those wide, dark eyes, and the luminescence along their jaw was back, faint, cautious, but present. I moved through the Marshall Plan, the decision by a nation with economic power to invest in rebuilding its former enemies rather than extracting from them. Not out of pure altruism, I was careful to note, but from the understanding that a rebuilt neighbor was safer than a desperate one. Strategy and decency arriving at the same destination. I showed the Council the formation of Doctors Without Borders. An organization of medical professionals who traveled voluntarily into active conflict zones to provide care to injured people regardless of which side of the conflict they were on. No political affiliation. No military allegiance. Just the decision that an injured person required treatment, and that the affiliation of the person causing the injury was not relevant to that fact. I showed the International Red Cross. The First International Criminal Court. The Chemical Weapons Convention, signed by the vast majority of Earth's nations, agreeing collectively that there were categories of harm so indiscriminate that they would be prohibited from conflict even when conflict itself was not. Humans drawing lines around their own capacity for destruction and agreeing, in writing, not to cross them. They bound themselves, a voice said from the chamber. I looked up. It was a delegate I had not heard from before, a smaller species, seated high in the curved rows, with 4 forward-facing eyes arranged in a vertical line. They built cages for their own worst instincts and then climbed inside them voluntarily. Yes, I said. That is one way to describe it. Why? The delegate leaned forward slightly. They were not required to do this. There was no external enforcement. Why would a species that had just demonstrated such capacity for destruction choose to limit itself? I looked at the delegate for a long moment. It was, actually, the right question. The best question anyone had asked all day. Because we were tired, I said. And because enough of us understood that the cost of continuing without limits was higher than the cost of accepting the limits. And because the people who had survived, the ones who had seen it directly, who had lived through it, many of them spent the rest of their lives making sure it was remembered. Making sure the account was complete. Making sure no future generation could open a history book and find a comfortable, softened version of what had happened. I thought of the letters in the Imperial War Museum. I thought of the testimonies recorded by survivors of the worst chapters of the century, given voluntarily, often painfully, often at great personal cost, because they had decided that the world needed to know. We remembered it, I said. All of it. And then we made structures to ensure we could not forget. I paused. Then I said the thing I had been building toward for 4 hours. We are the only species in this room that has looked at the worst version of itself, documented it with meticulous care, built international legal systems around its worst chapters, and then sent a historian, specifically a historian, to stand in front of the Galactic Council and show you all of it, without selecting the comfortable parts. Because we believe, with everything we are, that you cannot build something honest on a foundation of edited truth. The chamber was very still. The Cephali elder at the apex unfolded its upper limbs slowly, a gesture I had not seen it make before. Later I was told this was a Cephali expression of recognition. Of acknowledgement. It was not agreement. It was not approval. It was simply the acknowledgement that something had been said that deserved to be fully heard. The delegate who had first raised the motion to suspend our membership had not lowered its eyes from me since the moment I had resumed the presentation. It watched me now with an expression I could not quite read. Then it spoke. The motion, it said slowly, is withdrawn. No one argued. The arbiter made a note. The council will proceed to deliberation, it said. Ambassador Voss, you are requested to remain present. I remained present. What the Cephali elder told me during the final recess, in a private alcove off the main chamber, I will write here plainly. It said that the Council had been monitoring a region of space approximately 40 light-years from Earth's solar system. It said that the monitoring had been ongoing for 11 years. It said that what they had found there had no name yet in any galactic language because nothing like it had been encountered before. It said that every species currently in the Council chamber had reviewed the data from that region and arrived at the same conclusion: they did not know how to respond to it. Their histories had not given them the tools. Then the Sethali elder looked at me with those 4 eyes and it said, simply, yours might have. I stood in that alcove for a long time after the elder returned to the chamber. I looked at my hands. I thought about Oliver's face against the departure terminal glass. I thought, we came here to join a civilization. We may have come here to protect one. Then I straightened my jacket, and I walked back into the light. Part 5. The vote was not close. 31 in favor of human membership. 4 abstentions. 0 formal objections. The delegate who had entered the original motion had withdrawn it, and the 3 who had initially indicated support chose to follow rather than stand alone. I sat in the observer's seat beside the platform while the arbiter collected the voting tokens and announced the result in its smooth triple-tone voice, and I was very still, the way you are still when something you have been holding your breath about finally resolves and you are not entirely sure your legs will hold if you move. 31-4. Humanity was in. The arbiter presented me with the formal council registration document, a physical copy, which was traditional, each page embedded with the biosignatures of every voting delegate and the council's administrative seal, rendered in a material that I did not recognize and that was surprisingly warm to the touch. I held it and looked at it and I felt, very briefly and very privately, like crying. I did not cry. There would be time for that later, in my quarters, with the light off and the planet glowing gold and copper below the window. But in that moment, standing at the platform with 31 votes behind me and the document in my hands, I let myself feel it. The weight of it. The sheer, improbable fact of it. Humanity had come to the stars. And the stars had let us in. What I had not yet told Earth was the second part of that fact. The arbiter returned to its formal position and addressed the chamber. The council congratulates Earth on its admission. The formal species classification will be entered into the Galactic Registry within 48 standard hours. It paused. Then it said, the Council also notes that, following the review of Earth's cultural archive, a supplementary classification has been assigned. This is a designation with no prior precedent in Council history. The chamber murmured. I looked at the arbiter. Earth is classified, the arbiter said, as a recovered combatant civilization with institutional memory of interspecies conflict. This classification carries specific council responsibilities, which will be detailed in the formal assignment documentation. The short-form designation is Council Protectorate Guardian. Another murmur. Louder. I had not been told this was coming. I had been told, by the Sethali elder, that there was a conversation to be had about a specific threat. I had not been told that the classification and the assignment would be formalized in the open chamber, in front of all 41 delegations, without a private briefing first. I looked at the elder. It met my gaze. Its secondary eyes were open. It gave me a small, precise inclination of its upper body, not quite a bow. Closer to a salute, if a salute could be entirely composed of acknowledgement and gravity and the particular kind of respect that can only come from someone who has lived long enough to know how rare something actually is. I turned back to the arbiter. What does the assignment entail? I asked. The full briefing will be provided to the Earth Diplomatic Corps within the standard notification period, the arbiter said. The summary, which has been approved for open chamber disclosure, is as follows. The Council has identified a developing situation at the edge of monitored space that requires specialized response capabilities. All current Council member species have been assessed for compatibility with the response profile. Earth is the only member species whose documented history includes relevant direct experience. A delegate from the Areth Collective, the full voice this time, all subunits speaking together, asked, what kind of experience? The arbiter looked at the collective. Then it looked at me. I understood, in that moment, what the Sethali elder had been doing in that alcove. It had not been warning me. It had been preparing me. There is a difference, and the elder was old enough to know exactly which one the moment required. Organized response to large-scale existential threat, the arbiter said. Specifically, the capacity to make strategic decisions under conditions of severe uncertainty, to sustain collective function under prolonged pressure, and to do so while maintaining the preservation of non-combatant populations. These are capabilities that must be learned, and they cannot be learned except through direct historical engagement with the conditions that produce them. The chamber absorbed this. Then the delegate who had withdrawn the motion to suspend our membership raised its limb. It had not spoken since that withdrawal. It spoke now with a careful, measured quality, as though choosing each word individually. Are you saying, it said, that the reason Earth's history is what it is also the reason Earth is uniquely qualified to help the rest of us now? The arbiter considered the question. The Council does not speculate about causation, it said. The Council observes that the demonstrated capabilities required for the current situation are present in the Earth record and absent or insufficient in the records of all other current members. That is not an answer to my question, the delegate said. It is the most precise answer available, the arbiter said. I stepped forward. May I speak to this? The arbiter deferred to me. I looked at the delegate who had asked the question. I looked at the room. 41 species. The most diverse assembly of minds I had ever stood in front of, or would likely ever stand in front of again, each of them carrying histories I had only glimpsed the edges of, each of them watching me with a quality of attention that had shifted, subtly but definitively, from the attention they had brought to the room when I had first stood at this platform hours earlier. Then, they had been watching a new species explain itself. Now, they were watching something else. I could feel the difference without being able to fully name it. I cannot answer the question of why our history took the shape it did, I said. I can tell you that historians have been arguing about that for centuries, and we have not reached a consensus, and I do not expect to resolve it here, a quiet ripple through the room, something that might have been humor, in various alien registers. What I can tell you is this. I looked at the document in my hands. The warm, unfamiliar material of it. The biosignatures of 31 species sealed into its surface. Every human who lived through the worst chapters of our history, the ones who survived, and the ones who did not, all of them left something behind. The ones who did not come home left letters, and records, and photographs, and names carved into stone walls that have been standing in public squares for 100 years so that no one who walks past them can pretend those people did not exist. The ones who did come home spent the rest of their lives talking about what they had seen, writing it down, insisting that it be remembered exactly as it was, without softening. They built institutions. They signed conventions. They taught it in schools. I paused. They did not do all of that so that future generations would feel ashamed, I said. They did it so that future generations would be capable. Capable of understanding the full cost of certain choices. Capable of recognizing, early, the signs that lead toward the worst chapters. Capable of making different choices because they knew, specifically, precisely, in documented detail, what the other choices had cost. I looked at the Sethali elder. That knowledge is uncomfortable to look at. I know that. I have spent 4 hours today watching 41 civilizations discover that discomfort. But discomfort is not the same as harm. Discomfort is what you feel when you are learning something that has the power to change how you act. The elder's secondary eyes were fully open. My species did not arrive at the Galactic Council clean, I said. We arrived carrying every century of our history on our backs, visible, documented, and acknowledged. And I would not have it any other way. Because if we had arrived pretending to be something we are not, something smooth and untroubled and free of the weight of what we have been, we would have been useless to you. You would have admitted a fiction. You would have given a seat to a comfortable version of humanity that does not actually exist. I held up the registration document. You admitted the real one. The one that knows what the worst looks like and chose something different. The one that built accountability into law because we knew, from direct experience, what happens when it is absent. The one that has been wrong, and catastrophically wrong, and has spent a century making absolutely certain it would not forget how wrong it was. The room was quiet. If there is something coming that the Council does not know how to face, I said, then I can tell you this, you do not want the humanity that never experienced difficulty. You want the humanity that faced the worst version of itself and came out the other side capable of writing the Geneva Conventions. Those are the same people. That is us. That is what we are. I stopped. And the room was still. And then the Sethali elder unfolded all 4 of its upper limbs simultaneously, a gesture that, I would later be told, had not been made in that chamber in recorded council history, and held them outward. And one by one, in their own ways, in the expressions and postures and gestures that were meaningful in their own species registers, the delegates of the Galactic Council did something that looked different in each of them and meant, in all of them, the same thing. They received it. They acknowledged it. They let it land. The formal session ended 40 minutes later. The arbiter issued the standard closing statements. Delegates began to move toward the exit corridors. My council-assigned liaison, a young Veth named something unpronounceable that I had been asked to render as Cole, appeared at my elbow with a data pad and a schedule and 3 separate briefing requests from delegations who wanted follow-up conversations about the archive. I told Cole to schedule them all. Every single one. The Sethali Elder was the last delegate remaining in the chamber when I finally stepped away from the platform. It stood near the transparent floor, looking at the planet below. I walked to it. We stood side by side the way we had stood in the recess, looking at the bands of copper and gold and violet. 3,800 years, I said. 3,812, the Elder said. Approximately. What does it look like, from that distance? Watching a civilization go through what we just presented. The Elder considered the question for a long time. Its secondary eyes moved slowly in their independent scan. When I was very young, it said finally, my teacher showed me the records of a civilization that had existed before the council. A very old one. They had reached the stars and found them quiet. No other voices. Nothing to answer them. They had eventually stopped. Not from conflict. Not from catastrophe. From a kind of stillness. They had nothing left to push against. I looked at the Elder. What happened to them? They are gone, it said simply. The record remains. The Council preserves it. It is considered one of the great mysteries of early galactic history, how a species so capable and so peaceful simply ceased. I stood with that for a moment. And you think, I started. I think, the Elder said carefully, that peace without the knowledge of its opposite is a very fragile thing. I think that a civilization which has never encountered the cost of losing it may not know how to keep it when it is threatened. It turned to look at me. I do not think what your species experienced was good. I want to be very clear about that. I have 4,000 years of context for suffering, and what I saw in your archive today was not good. No, I agreed. It was not. But you survived it, the Elder said. And you built something from the survival. And the building was harder than the surviving, and you did it anyway. It tilted its head. Do you know how many species in this council have been tested to the degree your history tested yours? None of them, apparently, I said. None of them, the Elder confirmed. And the situation that the Arbiter referenced, the one at the edge of monitored space, it is going to test them. Not in the same way. But to a degree that the untested cannot fully prepare for. I thought about what it had said in the alcove. I thought about the 40 light-years of quiet space between here and whatever the monitors had found out there. I thought about 31 votes and a warm document and a designation with no prior precedent. We will need time, I said. To understand the situation. To go back to Earth and explain what is being asked. 2. You will have time, the Elder said. The situation is not immediate. It is building. Which is precisely why it was important that you be here now, and that you be seen now, and that the Council know what you are before the time for preparation ends. I nodded. We stood at the transparent floor together for another minute. The planet below turned slowly. The copper band slid past the gold. The deep blue pole at the far edge came into view, and it was even more beautiful from this angle than it had been before. Your ancestors were terrible, the Elder said. It was an exact echo of what it had said in the alcove, and I knew it was deliberate. And you remembered every one of them. Yes, I said. That is not a small thing, it said. In 4,000 years, I have met very few peoples who could do it. It placed one of its lower limbs briefly against my forearm. The warmth of it was surprising. I had expected something cold, reptilian, distant. It was not any of those things. Then it turned and walked toward the corridor and was gone. I stood at the edge of the floor alone. The station hummed around me. Below me, the gas giant turned. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my personal comm. I pulled up the contact for the Earth Diplomatic Office relay. The connection took 32 seconds to route through 4 relay stations across 40 light-years of space. I listened to the static of deep space while I waited, and I thought about Oliver with his face against the terminal glass, and I thought about the Secretary General who had put a historian on a ship and sent her to carry 5,000 years of human history into an alien council chamber without softening a single page of it. And I thought about all the people who had written those letters and given those testimonies and signed those conventions and built those courts because they had looked at the worst version of what they were and refused, absolutely refused, to pretend it had not happened. The relay connected. VOS to Earth Diplomatic Corps, I said. Relay message for the Secretary General. Priority 1. I paused. We're in, I said. 31 to 4. We have a seat. Another pause. There is also a briefing I need to schedule. It is significant. I will explain in full when I return. I looked at the planet. One more thing, for the record. The Council's formal classification for Earth is Recovered Combatant Civilization. Council Protectorate Guardian, I let the words settle into the relay. I think that's about right. I closed the connection. The station hummed. The planet turned. We came to the stars carrying all our wars on our backs. The centuries of them, the costs of them, the laws we had written to contain them, the tribunals we had built to account for them, the letters that had survived them, the names on the walls that insisted on being remembered long after the people who had carved them were gone. I had stood in a room of 41 civilizations and opened the full weight of it in front of them, and they had sat with it for 11 minutes of silence, and then they had voted us in. Turns out, that was exactly the right luggage to bring.